Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table when she'd once been the one they trusted to take the shot? They used to lean toward her voice. Now they leaned away. Caitlin Morrison sat at the far end of the long oak table, fingers laced, posture straight, eyes forward. On the projector screen, satellite images flickered, an abandoned mining complex outside a desert town that barely existed on most maps. The same town where her grandfather had built a life out of wood, steel, and stubborn honor. The same town where 4 men had walked into her shop and shattered a rifle that carried 40 years of memory in its grain. Property dispute turned hostile, the local sheriff was saying. Possible connection to federal investigation. Possible. Kat felt the word settle like dust on her shoulders. They didn't know who she had been. Not really. They saw a 27-year-old woman running a small-town armory. They didn't see the 6 deployments. The nights she'd spent on rooftops with a rifle cradled against her cheek. The way her pulse could slow on command. The way she could separate fear from function. They didn't know that 3 days ago, she had stood in her shop while a man named Marcus Brennan slammed her grandfather's Remington 700 against a counter until the walnut stock splintered. Break it. That was what he'd said. Break it, show this little girl what happens. She hadn't cried, not then. But something had broken. And something else had awakened. 72 hours earlier, the desert had looked the same. Wide, indifferent, honest in its emptiness. Kat had unlocked the door to Morrison Armory at 700 sharp. The bell above the frame chimed, a soft metallic note that had greeted customers for nearly 30 years. She'd run 5 miles before sunrise, 200 push-ups, 300 sit-ups. Routine wasn't about fitness. It was about control. Control was everything. She'd taken her grandfather's rifle from the wall that morning, the Remington 700, Brazilian walnut stock, custom barrel, scope upgraded 3 times, engraving etched clean and proud. Break barriers, not promises. W.M. Master Chief William Morrison. She'd traced the letters with her thumb. 15 years since he'd died. Heart attack, they'd said. Quick, painless. She had believed it, because believing it hurt less than asking questions. The bell chimed again. 4 men stepped inside. Marcus Brennan led them, tall, thick shoulders, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. We're not here to buy, sweetheart, he'd said. Sweetheart. The word had landed wrong. They talked about property value, strategic location, $50,000 in cash. She told them to leave. That was when Dwight grabbed the rifle. Even now, the memory came back in flashes. The sound of walnut cracking under force. The scope shattering against the counter. Her own voice, raw, unrecognizable when the stock split in 2. She had felt 8 years old again, standing beside her grandfather in the desert, him adjusting her stance. Between heartbeats, catbird, he'd whispered, that's when you take the shot. But there had been no shot that day. Only splinters. They had left her standing in a shop that suddenly felt too small for grief. And that night, she had made a call she'd sworn she would never make again. Commander Blackwell, the voice had answered, crisp, controlled. I need to talk. Silence. I'm listening. Blackwell had been the one who recruited her years ago, the one who saw something quiet and relentless in her, the one who knew why she'd walked away after Damascus. You don't leave that kind of unit without ghosts. Kat had told her about Marcus, about the land, about the rifle. There had been a pause on the other end. Caitlin, there's something you need to know. And just like that, the ground beneath her life had shifted. Her grandfather had filed a report with NCIS 2 weeks before his death. Illegal weapons transfers, military hardware going missing from Nellis Air Force Base. He said he had proof. 2 weeks later, he was dead. The medical examiner had ruled heart failure. But the blood work. Inconsistent. Digitalis. In controlled doses, it mimicked cardiac arrest perfectly. Kat had slid down the wall of her shop, phone pressed to her ear. "You're telling me he was poisoned?" "I'm telling you," Blackwell had said softly, "that the man he reported may still be operating, and your property sits directly in the corridor of that operation. Grief is loud at first. Then it becomes cold. Cold was easier to carry. Give me 3 days, Kat had said, and give me a name." The name came the next afternoon. Colonel Randolph Vance. Retired decorated, Medal of Honor. And connected to a growing network of stolen military weapons, moving quietly through the desert. Marcus Brennan wasn't the top. He was muscle. Vance was command. Kat gathered her team carefully. Nathaniel Morrison, her uncle, former Marine, the only man she trusted to hold a rifle with steady hands and a clean conscience. Rebecca Dalton, ex-Army intelligence, sharp mind, sharper instincts. Dr. Edmund Sterling, combat medic, family friend, the one who had stood beside her at her grandfather's funeral. And reluctantly, Special Agent Garrett Holloway from the FBI. They sat around her counter, where the rifle had been broken. She laid out the plan. "I'll sell," she said, "or at least pretend to." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "You're asking to walk back into a room with the man who may have killed your grandfather." "I know. You're not made of stone, Kat." No. She was. She was angry and afraid, and tired of not knowing. But more than anything, she was determined. "I don't want revenge," she said quietly. "I want truth." The first meeting took place at a bar on the edge of town. Dusty ridge, faded neon, cracked vinyl booths. Marcus was there, Dwight Trent Silas. And then Vance arrived. Silver hair, calm smile, a medal pinned discreetly to his collar. He had looked at her like he'd known her since she was a child. "Your grandfather was a good man," he'd said. Sometimes that sentence is the first step toward betrayal. He'd spoken in careful phrases, about gray areas, about hard choices, about national security. And then he'd said the things she hadn't been prepared for. "Your grandfather saw something he shouldn't have." Her pulse had thundered in her ears. "Heart attack," he'd added lightly. "Tragic." Tragic. As if the word could sanitize murder. She had worn a wire. She had recorded every word. But when she left that bar, hands shaking against the steering wheel, she knew something else. This wasn't just about stolen weapons. It was about legacy. About a man who had believed in the rules, who had trusted the system. And about the quiet realization that the system had not protected him. That night, Kat lay awake staring at the ceiling of a rented safe house. What if she was wrong? What if pushing this further got someone killed? Her team trusted her. Nathaniel trusted her. And deep down, she still carried the weight of the last mission in Syria, the one where she'd come home and 3 others hadn't. Survivor's guilt is a quiet companion. It doesn't shout, it waits. She pressed her palms to her eyes. "Do it right," her grandfather had once told her, "or don't do it at all." The next call she made was the one that changed everything. "I don't want 50,000, she told Marcus. "I want in." Silence. Then interest. That night, they told her to meet at an industrial complex outside town. Come alone. She knew what that meant. It meant suspicion. It meant risk. It meant walking into the kind of situation she'd spent years training for. Only this time, it wasn't a foreign desert. It was home. And the stakes weren't abstract. They were personal. As she drove toward the warehouse, the sun bled red across the horizon. Nathaniel lay prone 1,200 yards away on a ridge, rifle steady. Rebecca monitored her vitals. Garrett positioned his agents. Kat stepped inside. Crates lined the walls, stenciled military markings, enough weapons to arm a battalion. Vance stood in the center like a conductor before an orchestra. "Why should I trust you?" he asked. "Because my grandfather died believing in men like you," she almost said. Instead, she lied. "Because honor doesn't pay," she said. "Cash does." For a moment, she thought she'd sold it. Then Marcus drew a pistol and pressed it to her temple. "Or," Vance said mildly, "we talk about who you really are, Petty Officer Caitlin Morrison, DEVGRU." Her blood ran cold. They had done their homework. Every mission, every medal, the silver star she never displayed. "You think we wouldn't check?" Vance asked. Fear flickered. Not of dying. Of failing. If she died here, Vance would walk. Her grandfather's truth would stay buried. "Who sent you?" Marcus demanded. She could hear Rebecca in her ear. "Abort. Abort." But Kat did something unexpected. She laughed. "You killed my grandfather," she said. The room went still. She spoke clearly, calmly, nomming dates, nomming reports, nomming digitalis. Vance's expression never cracked. "You have theories," he said. "I have recordings." She played the audio from the bar. His voice filled the warehouse. For a split second, his composure shifted. Then he smiled. "You think that's enough?" Maybe it was. But outside, sirens began to wail. Marcus's finger tightened on the trigger. And 1,200 yards away, Nathaniel Morrison made a decision no manual could cover. He fired. The shot cracked through the desert night. Marcus fell. Chaos erupted. Kat moved on instinct, disarmed Trent, dropped low, controlled the space. FBI agents flooded the warehouse. Dwight went down face first. Silas screamed, clutching a wounded shoulder. Vance stood perfectly still as cuffs closed around his wrists. "You just made a mistake," he told her. "No," Kat said quietly. "You did 15 years ago." 3 months later, the courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Guilty. On all counts. Conspiracy, murder, arms trafficking. The medal was revoked. The legacy dismantled. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. Kat ignored them. This wasn't about headlines. It was about a letter her grandfather had left behind, tucked into a box of old photographs. "If something happens to me, do it right, do it legal, do it with honor." She stood in Morrison's armory that evening, a new Remington mounted on the wall. The engraving read. She broke barriers and kept promises. Nathaniel stood behind her. "He'd be proud," he said. She nodded. She felt proud. Not because she'd taken down a colonel. Not because she'd survived. But because she hadn't let anger turn her into something unrecognizable. She had been anxious, determined, furious, broken, hopeful. And through all of it, she had chosen restraint over rage. Outside, the Nevada desert stretched endless and patient. Kat locked the door of the shop and listened to the bell chime once more. Sometimes strength doesn't shout. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it endures long enough to speak the truth when no one else will. And sometimes dignity doesn't beg for mercy. It simply acts. What if the hardest part wasn't facing the enemy, but facing the memory of the last time you failed? Kat didn't sleep the night after the warehouse raid. The arrests had been clean, the evidence overwhelming. Colonel Randolph Vance had been led away in cuffs, his calm smile finally gone. The weapons were cataloged. The news vans circled. The FBI congratulated itself in low, satisfied tones. But when the adrenaline drained from her bloodstream, something else took its place. Silence. She stood alone in Morrison's armory long after everyone else had left. The shop lights were off. Only the small lamp behind the counter glowed, casting long shadows across the walls where rifles hung in neat, respectful rows. The broken pieces of her grandfather's Remington were still in a box beneath the counter. She hadn't thrown them away. She couldn't. Her fingers hovered over the lid. For a moment, she considered opening it again, running her hands over the splintered walnut, letting herself feel the full weight of what had been taken. Instead, she stepped back. Because grief, she'd learned, can become addictive if you let it. Her phone buzzed softly in her hand. "Rebecca, you're still there, aren't you?" Rebecca asked without preamble. "Yes." A pause. "You did good tonight." Kat leaned against the counter, staring at the faint outline on the wall where the Remington used to hang. "Marcus is dead." Rebecca didn't soften it. "He pulled first." "I know. You saved yourself." "I know." But knowing didn't quiet the feeling. Marcus Brennan had broken her grandfather's rifle. He had threatened her. He had pointed a gun at her head. Still, a life had ended. And she had grown up in a house where her grandfather polished metals with the same hands he used to tuck her in at night. Violence, he used to say, is a last resort. If you reach for it too easily, you've already lost something. "Kat," Rebecca said gently, "don't rewrite this. You didn't go there looking for blood." No. She had gone looking for truth. And truth sometimes comes with a body count. After she hung up, she finally opened the box. The stock lay in two jagged halves, the engraving still visible on one fragment. "Break barriers, not promises." She traced the words again. "I kept the promise," she whispered. But her voice trembled. Because somewhere inside, she still felt like the little girl who had stood helpless, while men twice her size destroyed something sacred. The next morning, the town woke up buzzing. By noon, Morrison's armory had 3 reporters parked outside, and a local radio station asking for comment. Kat didn't answer. She opened the shop at 7 sharp. Routine mattered. An elderly man named Frank came in at 8:15 to pick up a hunting scope he'd ordered 2 weeks ago. He looked at her differently. Not afraid. Not quite. Just aware. "You okay, kid?" he asked quietly while she rang him up. "Yes, sir." He nodded once. "Your granddad would have handled it the same way." The words landed heavier than he knew. Because she wasn't sure that was true. Her grandfather had believed in systems, in reporting up the chain, in doing things by the book. And the book had failed him. That afternoon, Garrett Holloway walked in, tie loosened, jacket slung over his shoulder. "You're avoiding my calls," he said. "I've been busy." "Busy reopening your shop less than 12 hours after dismantling a 15-year trafficking ring." She gave him a look. He sighed and leaned against the glass counter. "Internal Affairs is reviewing the shooting," he said. "Standard procedure." "Nathaniel." "Yes." She felt the familiar tightening in her chest. "It was a clean shot," Garrett continued. "Marcus was armed. You were in imminent danger. Your uncle's statement matches the audio feed. He'll be cleared." "Cleared," she repeated softly. Garrett watched her carefully. "You regret it." It wasn't a question. Kat took a long breath. "I regret that it got to that point." "That's not the same thing." "No," she admitted, "it's not." Garrett's expression shifted, less agent, more human. "Vance is talking." Her eyes snapped up. "What?" "He wants a deal." Anger flared hot and sudden. "For what?" "To protect his legacy." Of course. Men like Vance didn't fear prison as much as they feared irrelevance. "He's offering names," Garrett continued. Other officers, contractors, politicians. And in exchange, reduced sentence. Kat stepped away from the counter, walking toward the window. Outside, the desert shimmered under late morning heat, dry, unforgiving. He murdered my grandfather. Yes. He poisoned him. Yes. And he wants a shorter sentence. Garrett didn't argue. That's how this works, he said quietly. You want the network dismantled. Sometimes you take the bigger win. She closed her eyes. This was the part no one romanticized. Justice wasn't clean. It was negotiated, measured, strategic. Do it, she said finally. Garrett blinked. Do it. Take the deal, if it brings down more of them. He studied her face. That can't be easy to say. It's not about easy. She turned back toward him. It's about finishing it. That night, she drove out to the ridge where Nathaniel had taken the shot. The desert was quieter here. No traffic, no neon lights, just wind moving across open land. He was already there, sitting on the tailgate of his truck, rifle case beside him. You shouldn't be alone out here, he said as she approached. I'm not. He smiled faintly. They stood side by side, looking down toward the distant industrial complex now taped off with federal warning signs. You hesitated, Nathaniel said after a while. She didn't pretend not to understand. Yes. Why? Because part of me didn't want to become what they are. Because part of me is still tired of surviving when other people don't. Because pulling triggers is easier than living with them. I wanted to make sure, she said simply. Nathaniel nodded. That's why you're different. She glanced at him. I killed men overseas without losing sleep, she admitted. Why does this feel heavier? Because this wasn't war, he said. This was home. The word settled deep. Home. Where violence echoes longer. They stood in silence for a while. You know, Nathaniel added, your granddad once told me something after Panama. She looked at him. He said the hardest part wasn't pulling the trigger. It was making sure you still recognized yourself afterward. Her throat tightened. And do I? She asked quietly. Nathaniel studied her face in the fading light. Yes. That answer meant more than any court verdict. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Kat felt something shift. Not relief. Not yet. But clarity. Vance would try to bargain. The system would grind forward. Marcus's death would be reviewed and filed and archived. The world would move on. But she wouldn't. Not entirely. She would carry this. The weight, the responsibility, the knowledge that sometimes justice arrives wrapped in compromise. She walked back to her truck feeling both heavier and stronger. Strength wasn't about winning. It was about absorbing the cost without letting it hollow you out. Later that week, she mounted a new rifle on the wall. Custom built. Brazilian walnut. The engraving freshly cut. She ran her fingers over the wood, remembering her grandfather's steady hands guiding hers when she was 8 years old. Between heartbeats, he had whispered. She understood now. It wasn't just about marksmanship. It was about patience, about choosing the moment, about not firing out of anger, but out of necessity. She locked up the shop that evening and stepped outside into the cooling desert air. The sky was streaked with violet and gold, beautiful in a way that made you forget how harsh it could be. She breathed in slowly. Some barriers are external. Corrupt men, broken systems, violence dressed in metals. But the hardest barriers are internal. Doubt, guilt, fear of becoming what you fight. She had broken one. There would be others. But she wasn't the little girl in the shop anymore. And she wasn't just a former SEAL chasing ghosts. She was a granddaughter who had demanded truth. And a woman learning that justice doesn't erase pain, it gives it direction. The wind picked up, brushing against her jacket. She looked up at the open sky and allowed herself, for the first time in days, a small, steady breath of hope. Because sometimes strength isn't loud. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to keep going, even when the fight is over. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is live with what you've done and still choose to stand tall. What happens after the headlines fade, when the silence comes back louder than the gunfire ever was? 3 weeks after the arrests, the town had already started moving on. The news vans were gone. The industrial complex sat empty, federal seals on its rusted doors. Colonel Randolph Vance was being transferred between holding facilities, while lawyers argued over jurisdiction and sealed documents. And Morrison's armory was open at 700 sharp. Kat unlocked the door like she always did. The bell chimed. The desert sun crept over the horizon in slow gold streaks. Routine had become her anchor. If she stopped moving, stopped working, her mind wandered to places she didn't want to revisit. Marcus falling. The sound of Nathaniel's rifle echoing across open land. Vance's calm voice describing murder like it was a paperwork inconvenience. She moved through the shop with steady hands. Inventory check, coffee brewed, counter wiped clean. At 8:12, she realized she hadn't thought about Syria in almost 24 hours. That felt like progress. Or maybe just distraction. The door opened and a teenage girl stepped inside, maybe 16, maybe 17. Nervous, hoodie sleeves pulled over her hands. "Are you Caitlin Morrison?" she asked. Kat nodded slowly. "Yes. My dad said you teach marksmanship classes." "I do." The girl swallowed. "He doesn't want me to come. He says it's not for girls." There it was. The familiar edge. Kat leaned back against the counter, studying her. "What do you want?" she asked gently. The girl hesitated, then straightened slightly. "I want to learn." Kat felt something flicker in her chest. Not anger, not pride. Recognition. "I run classes on Saturdays," she said. "Safety first, discipline always. You show up ready to work, I'll teach you." The girl's eyes brightened. "Even if my dad doesn't like it." Kat allowed the smallest smile. Especially then. After she left, the shop felt lighter. For weeks, Kat had been the center of a story she never asked to headline. The granddaughter, the former SEAL, the woman who helped take down a decorated colonel. But this felt different. This felt like building instead of dismantling. Still, the nights were harder. Sleep came in fragments. She'd wake at 02:17, heart pounding, convinced she'd heard a door slam or boots on concrete. The warehouse replayed in her mind in sharp flashes. Marcus's eyes widening. Vance's expression never quite cracking. And underneath it all, the memory she tried hardest to outrun. Damascus. The mission that ended her career. 4 operators on a rooftop. Intel compromised. Extraction delayed. She had taken the shot that neutralized the immediate threat. But the secondary explosion had come from somewhere they hadn't anticipated. She still heard the blast sometimes. Still saw the dust settling where her team should have been. She had been the only one pulled from the rubble alive. Honorable discharge, they'd called it. Medical and psychological evaluation complete. Fit for civilian reintegration. No one writes survivor's guilt on official paperwork. She rolled onto her side and stared at the ceiling. "Why me?" she whispered into the darkness. No answer came. The next morning, Garrett showed up unannounced again. "You're becoming predictable," she told him. "Occupational hazard." He looked more tired than usual. Vance's attorneys are pushing hard, he said. They're arguing unlawful surveillance, claiming your recording at the bar violated state consent laws. Kat folded her arms. And it might get messy. She felt the old tension tightening in her spine. You told me we had enough. We do, he said quickly. The weapons in the warehouse alone are enough for serious time, but the murder charge, that's where they're attacking. Her jaw tightened. They're trying to paint your grandfather as unstable, suggesting he misinterpreted classified operations. The words hit harder than she expected. Unstable. William Morrison had been disciplined to the bone, measured, thoughtful. They're going to drag his name through court, Garrett continued. I wanted you prepared. Prepared? She nodded once. Let them. Garrett studied her face. That doesn't bother you. It does, she admitted, but truth doesn't collapse because someone insults it. He gave a small nod. You're stronger than most people I know. She didn't answer. Strength was relative. Strength was getting out of bed when your mind wanted to replay every mistake you'd ever made. Strength was choosing not to hate. That afternoon, Nathaniel stopped by with a quiet heaviness in his posture. They cleared the shooting, he said. Officially justified, no charges. She exhaled slowly. You okay? She asked. He hesitated. I've taken lives in war, he said, but I've never taken one to protect family. She stepped closer. You didn't hesitate. I did, he admitted, just for a second. She met his eyes. So did I. They stood in that shared truth for a moment. War teaches you decisiveness. Home complicates it. I keep thinking, Nathaniel continued, if I'd missed. You didn't. But if I had. She reached out and squeezed his hand. But you didn't. Sometimes that's all there is. The following Saturday, the teenage girl returned. Her name was Ava. She stood on the outdoor range, shoulders tense, hands unsure on the rifle Kat handed her. Breathe, Kat said softly. Don't fight the recoil, work with it. Ava nodded, trying to steady herself. Other students watched quietly, some curious, some skeptical. Kat adjusted Ava's stance gently. Between heartbeats, she said without thinking. The words froze her for half a second. Grandpa. She swallowed and continued. Find the stillness, that's where control lives. Ava fired. The shot cracked clean through the morning air. The target rang. Not perfect, but centered enough. Ava lowered the rifle slowly, eyes wide. I did that, she whispered. Yes, Kat said. You did. In that moment, something inside her shifted again. Maybe this was the real inheritance. Not the rifle. Not the shop. The steadiness. The refusal to shrink. That evening, alone again in the armory, she opened the drawer where her grandfather's final letter rested. She read it slowly, tracing his handwriting. Don't become like them. That line always caught her. Because anger would have been easier. Hatred simpler. But hatred corrodes quietly. It changes the way you look at everyone. And she refused to let Vance take that too. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She hesitated before answering. Caitlin Morrison, a smooth voice said. Her body went rigid. I'm one of Colonel Vance's attorneys. Of course. We'd like to request a meeting. For what purpose? My client believes you may have misinterpreted certain events. He'd like to clarify. Clarify? She felt her pulse steady instead of spike. No, she said calmly. Miss Morrison, cooperating could simplify matters for everyone. You tell your client something for me. A pause. I don't need clarification. I was there. She hung up. For a brief second, her hands trembled. Not from fear, from anger. Then she placed her palms flat on the counter and breathed. This was the next phase. No more gunfire. No more immediate danger. Now came the psychological pressure. The attempts to rewrite history. To soften guilt. To blur accountability. She wouldn't let them. Because the real battle wasn't just about prison sentences. It was about narrative. About making sure her grandfather's name remained what it always had been. Honorable. She locked the door at closing time and stepped outside into the cooling desert air. The sky stretched endless and open. She thought about Damascus, about the rooftop, about surviving when others didn't. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to say it aloud. I didn't fail them. The words felt fragile, but true. And maybe that was the deeper reason she'd fought so hard these past weeks. Not just to clear her grandfather's name, but to prove to herself that she could still finish something. That she wasn't defined by the mission that broke her team. She looked back at the armory sign, swinging gently in the breeze. Morrison's Armory. The name meant something again. Not because of revenge. Not because of headlines. But because she had stood in the fire and chosen not to burn. Sometimes the fight doesn't end when the enemy falls. Sometimes it begins when you have to live with what remains. And sometimes healing isn't loud. It's the quiet decision to teach the next generation how to stand steady. Even when their hands shake. What if the most dangerous enemy isn't the one in front of you, but the one who learns from your mistakes? The fourth week after the arrests, the first threat arrived without a signature. No return address, no postage mark that made sense. Just a plain envelope slipped beneath the door of Morrison's Armory, sometime between closing and dawn. Kat found it at 7:03. She knew something was wrong the second she saw it. Instinct doesn't shout, it tightens. She locked the door behind her before picking it up. Inside was a single photograph. Taken from a distance. Grainy, slightly blurred. But unmistakable. Her. Standing on the outdoor range with Ava, adjusting her stance. The date stamp was from 2 days ago. On the back, 3 words written in block letters. You missed one. Her pulse didn't spike. It slowed. That was always the tell. She scanned the street through the blinds. Empty, quiet, desert wind brushing dust across pavement. She took a photo of the photograph and sent it to Garrett. Call me now. He arrived in under 20 minutes. This was Vance, he said immediately after examining it. He's in federal custody, restricted communication. I know. She kept her voice steady. This is someone else. Part of the network, Garrett said grimly, or someone who benefited from it. You told me Vance was talking. He is. Then someone's nervous. Garrett nodded once. You want protection. She almost laughed. I've had protection, she said quietly. It didn't stop Damascus. He held her gaze. This isn't overseas. No, she agreed, it's worse. Because overseas, the enemy was expected. Here it was hidden among neighbors, among customers, among people who smiled and shook hands. Garrett placed the photo back into an evidence sleeve. We'll increase patrol presence, he said, quietly. Don't scare the town. I won't. After he left, Kat remained still behind the counter for a long time. You missed one. The words weren't about Marcus. They weren't about Dwight or Trent or Silas. They were about something bigger. Someone bigger. That afternoon, she drove to the cemetery. It wasn't something she did often. Her grandfather had always said graves were for the living, not the dead. But today she needed the quiet. The headstone was simple. William Morrison, Master Chief, beloved father, grandfather, patriot. She sat cross-legged in the dry grass. They're still out there, she said softly, parts of it the network. The wind moved gently across the ground. You always said you couldn't fight shadows with anger. Her throat tightened. I'm trying not to. For a moment, she let herself feel the old ache. The one that had started 15 years ago. The one that had deepened 3 weeks ago in that warehouse. I won't miss this time, she whispered. The next call she made wasn't to Garrett. It was to Rebecca. I need you to dig, Kat said. On what? Vance's financials, shell companies, any transactions that weren't tied directly to the warehouse. Rebecca didn't hesitate. You think there's a second operation? I think no one builds something that large without redundancy. Okay, Rebecca said, give me 12 hours. That night, Kat couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Not paranoia. Awareness. She turned off the lights in the shop and stepped outside into the dark. The desert had a way of amplifying silence. She stood there, breathing slowly. Between heartbeats. Nothing moved. Still, she knew. The next morning, Rebecca's voice came through tight and focused. You were right. Kat leaned against the counter. Tell me. There's a subsidiary account tied to Vance's retirement fund. Small transactions at first, then larger ones, routed through a logistics company based in Arizona. Legitimate. On paper. And off paper. Unclear. Rebecca paused. But here's the thing. The CEO, former Army logistics officer, dishonorably discharged in 2012, names Daniel Kessler. The name meant nothing. Any connection to my grandfather? Indirect, Rebecca said. Kessler was stationed at Nellie's the same year your grandfather filed his report. Kat's jaw tightened. So Vance wasn't alone. No, Rebecca agreed. He was just visible. The anger that rose wasn't explosive. It was cold. Calculated. The kind that moves instead of shouts. That afternoon, Kat reopened the range for another class. Ava returned, more confident this time. You okay? The girl asked quietly while loading magazines. Why wouldn't I be? I saw the news, Ava said, about the colonel. Kat studied her for a moment. You ever notice how people think strength means not being scared? Ava nodded slightly. I'm scared sometimes, Kat admitted. The trick is not letting fear choose for you. Ava absorbed that. Then she raised the rifle again. The shot rang cleaner this time. Progress. After class, Nathaniel approached her by the trucks. Garrett filled me in, he said, about the photo. She nodded. You thinking what I'm thinking? That it's not over. Nathaniel's gaze hardened slightly. Then we prepare. Preparation didn't mean panic. It meant awareness. They adjusted routines, varied drive times, installed additional cameras discreetly. Kat hated that part. She didn't want Morrison's armory to feel like a bunker. But she also refused to be naive. 3 nights later at 01:36 the alarm triggered. Kat was already awake. She didn't rush. She dressed methodically, checked her sidearm, called Garrett before she even started the truck. I'm en route, he said. When she arrived, red and blue lights were already flashing against the storefront. The front window was intact. The alarm had tripped from the back. Garrett met her near the alley. Someone tried the rear door, he said. Camera caught a partial. He handed her a tablet. The footage showed a hooded figure testing the handle, face obscured, movements controlled, not random vandalism. Professional. They knew the camera angles, she said quietly. Yes, and they wanted me to see it. Garrett studied her. You're calm. I'm focused. Inside, nothing had been taken. Nothing broken. Just the message. You missed one. Back at the shop, after the officers cleared out, Kat stood alone again beneath the low hum of fluorescent lights. This wasn't about intimidation anymore. It was a challenge. A test. Would she retreat into safety? Or would she step forward again? Her phone buzzed. Rebecca. I found something else, she said without greeting. Kessler's company just leased warehouse space outside Flagstaff, same layout as the mining complex. How recent? 2 weeks ago. Right after Vance's arrest. He was rebuilding. Or someone was. Kat closed her eyes for a second. Here it was again. The crossroads. She could hand everything to the FBI and step back. Or she could lean in. Her grandfather had reported what he saw and trusted the system. It had cost him his life. But that didn't mean the system wasn't worth fighting through. She dialed Garrett. I think I found your missing piece, she said. He was silent for a moment. You're not going to sit this one out, are you? No. A pause. You understand the risk. Yes. You could walk away. You've already done enough. Enough. The word felt small. Justice doesn't end when it's inconvenient, she said quietly. Garrett exhaled slowly. Then we do it right. After she hung up, she looked around the shop. At the rifles on the wall. At the new Remington with its fresh engraving. At the letter folded carefully in her drawer. Don't become like them. She wouldn't. This wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about ego. It was about finishing what had been started, without losing herself in the process. She stepped outside again into the cool desert night. The wind moved steadily across open ground. Somewhere beyond that horizon, Daniel Kessler was operating under the assumption that fear would quiet her. He didn't understand something fundamental. She had already lost almost everything once. Fear didn't hold the same leverage anymore. She looked up at the stars scattered across the sky. You missed one, she murmured. A slow, steady breath filled her lungs. No, she said softly, I'm just getting started. Because sometimes resilience isn't about surviving the first storm. It's about standing back up when you realize the sky hasn't cleared yet. And sometimes strength means choosing the harder path, not because you crave the fight, but because you refuse to leave it unfinished. What if walking away would be safer, but staying meant finally outrunning the ghost that's been chasing you for years? The drive to Flagstaff was quiet. No sirens, no convoy, no dramatic urgency. Just Kat's truck cutting through long stretches of desert highway, while the sun slowly sank behind distant ridgelines. Garrett had argued for a larger task force. She argued for subtlety. If Kessler knows we're coming, she'd said, he disappears. So they compromised. FBI surveillance units positioned wide, Rebecca running remote intel, Nathaniel shadowing from a separate vehicle 2 miles back. And Kat, driving alone. The warehouse Kessler leased sat on the outskirts of an industrial strip, anonymous, forgettable, beige concrete, faded company logo on the side, Kessler Logistics. On paper, they moved agricultural equipment and construction supplies. On paper, everything was clean. Kat parked across the street and waited. Breathing slow. Between heartbeats. A black SUV rolled into the lot at 1942. Daniel Kessler stepped out. Mid-40s, clean haircut, crisp button-down shirt, the kind of man who could sit on a nonprofit board and smile for cameras. He didn't look like someone who'd bankroll weapons trafficking. He looked like someone who'd donate to veteran charities, which made him more dangerous. Garrett's voice came softly through her earpiece. Visual confirmed. Copy, she replied. They watched for 40 minutes. 2 more vehicles arrived. Cargo van, unmarked pickup. No visible weapons. No overt signs of illegal transfer. Just men unloading sealed crates under dim security lights. Could be legitimate, one of the FBI agents murmured over comms. Kat didn't respond. Her instincts didn't buzz loudly. They hummed. This was familiar. The calm before something precise. Her phone vibrated in her cup holder. Unknown number. Again. She answered without greeting. You're persistent, the voice said. Smooth, controlled. Kessler. Her grip tightened on the steering wheel. You left a photograph on my shop floor, she said evenly. That's not subtle. A soft chuckle. I wanted your attention. You have it. Good, then you'll appreciate this courtesy. She watched as Kessler stepped away from the warehouse entrance, packing slowly near his SUV. He was on the phone. With her. You dismantled Vance's operation, he continued. Impressive, reckless but impressive. You're rebuilding it. Rebuilding, he echoed lightly. That implies wrongdoing. She kept her breathing even. You were at Nellie's in 2011. A pause. Many people were. My grandfather filed a report. Yes, Kessler said calmly, he did. The confirmation was quiet. Almost gentle. Her pulse dipped lower. You were involved. I was efficient, he corrected. Vance handled optics, I handled logistics. There it was. Not a confession shouted in anger. A matter-of-fact admission. You poisoned him, she said. No, Kessler replied. That was Vance's decision. I advised restraint. Restraint. As if murder were a boardroom debate. You could have stopped it. And compromise a 15-year operation, he asked mildly. Your grandfather was one man. The words landed harder than the threat. Your grandfather was one man. She swallowed the anger before it surfaced. And what am I? She asked quietly. A beat of silence. You're a variable. Garrett's voice cut in low. Cat, keep him talking. She stepped out of her truck. Slowly. Kessler noticed immediately. Their eyes locked across the street. He didn't flinch. I assume you have federal friends nearby, he said. You assume correctly. And yet, he continued, glancing subtly around, no one's moving. Because they needed probable cause. Because sealed crates under dim lights weren't enough. You left me a message, she said, walking slowly toward the edge of the lot. You said I missed one. You did. Explain. Kessler tilted his head slightly. You dismantled a branch, not the tree. The wind picked up across the asphalt. She felt exposed standing there, not physically but strategically. What do you want? She asked. To see if you're as disciplined as your grandfather. Anger flared again. You knew him. I respected him, Kessler said, which is why I warned Vance. She froze. Warned him about what? That killing a man like William Morrison creates martyrs. The words settled heavy between them. You should have listened to yourself, she said. Yes, he admitted softly, perhaps. Garrett's voice came sharp now. Cat, we've got movement inside. Thermal shows military-grade hardware. There it was. Probable cause. Stand by, Garrett ordered. Teams move on my signal. Kessler watched her expression change. They found something, didn't they? He asked calmly. You underestimated the wrong variable, she said. He smiled faintly. No, he replied, I was measuring you. Sirens erupted from both ends of the industrial strip. Unmarked SUVs flooded the lot. FBI agents moved fast and clean. Federal agents, hands where we can see them. Kessler didn't run. He didn't reach for anything. He simply raised his hand slowly. As agents moved past Kat toward the warehouse doors, she stepped closer to him. You could have walked away, he said quietly. So could you. I built something efficient, he replied. You built something corrupt. He studied her face. You think removing me ends it? No, she said honestly, but it's a start. Agents cuffed him without resistance. As they led him toward a vehicle, he paused beside her. You carry guilt, he said softly. The words hit deeper than he knew. From overseas. Her throat tightened. He had done his research. You think this fixes that? He asked. No, she answered. But it keeps it from spreading. For the first time, his composure flickered. Just slightly. As the SUV door shut behind him, Kat felt the tension drain not completely, but enough to breathe fully. Garrett approached. Warehouse is stacked, he said. Stolen components, serialized weapons, manifests tied to overseas buyers. He gave her a long look. You good? She nodded. I'm good. But as the adrenaline faded, something unexpected surfaced. Not triumph. Not relief. Closure. Small, fragile. Kessler hadn't begged. Hadn't raged. He tried to destabilize her with insight. With knowledge of her guilt. And she hadn't broken. On the drive back, Nathaniel pulled alongside her at a red light. He rolled down his window. You okay? She nodded. He tried to get in my head. Nathaniel gave a faint smile. Did it work? She considered that. For years, she had wondered if surviving Damascus meant she had failed. If living when others didn't was its own kind of betrayal. But tonight, standing across from a man who saw people as expendable variables, she understood something. Survival isn't guilt. It's responsibility. No, she said finally, it didn't. Back at Morrison's armory 2 days later, the bell chimed again. Ava walked in, grinning. Dad says I can keep coming, she announced proudly. Why the change of heart? He said if I'm going to learn from someone, it might as well be the best. Kat felt heat rise to her cheeks. I'm not the best, she said. Ava tilted her head. Then why does everyone listen when you talk? Kat paused. Because I've seen what happens when no one does. Instead, she said, because I don't raise my voice unless I have to. They walked out to the range together. The desert stretched wide and honest under the morning sun. As Ava took her stance, Kat felt something steady inside her. Not the rigid discipline of combat. Not the cold focus of confrontation. Something warmer. Purpose. The network wasn't fully gone. It might never be. Corruption rarely disappears completely. But she had done what she could. Without losing herself. Without becoming what she hunted. She watched Ava fire again, smoother this time, center mass. Progress. Between heartbeats. Kat closed her eyes for just a second and let the wind brush against her face. She had been anxious. Broken. Determined. Afraid. She had stood in rooms where men tried to reduce her to a variable. But she had chosen not to let anger define her decisions. Justice wasn't about destruction. It was about direction. And sometimes, the bravest act isn't pulling the trigger. It's refusing to let guilt, fear, or rage pull it for you. As the echo of the shot faded into open sky, Kat allowed herself a small, steady breath. Because strength isn't proven by how many enemies fall. It's proven by how much of yourself you keep intact while you fight. And sometimes, redemption doesn't roar. It stands quietly in the sunlight, steady between heartbeats. What happens when the fight finally goes quiet and you're left alone with yourself? The arrests made national news this time. Not just a disgraced colonel, not just a hidden warehouse. A network, multi-state, international buyers, logistics pipelines disguised as veteran-owned supply chains. Daniel Kessler's name replaced Vance in headlines. And for the first time since her grandfather's death, William Morrison's name appeared beside the word vindicated. Kat didn't watch the broadcasts. She heard about them from customers, from Garrett, from strangers who walked into the armory just to shake her hand. You did him proud. You're a hero. You saved lives. Each compliment landed with an odd weight. Because none of them had seen the quiet parts. The 2 a.m. ceiling starring. The doubt. The hesitation before stepping into that warehouse weeks ago. They hadn't seen her hands tremble after the phone call from Kessler. Hero was a clean word. Reality wasn't. One evening, after closing, she found herself alone on the range as the sky melted into amber and violet. No students. No targets set up. Just open land. She carried her grandfather's Remington to the firing line and rested it on the table. For a long moment, she didn't touch it. I thought finishing this would feel different, she said softly into the wind. The desert didn't answer. It never did. She loaded a single round. Steady hands. Controlled breath. Between heartbeats. She aimed not at a silhouette target, but at a small steel plate far out near the back fence. Small, precise, honest. The shot rang out, sharp and clean. The plate chimed a second later. She lowered the rifle and closed her eyes. The sound didn't bring adrenaline. It brought stillness. For years, she had associated rifles with loss. Damascus. The rooftop. The explosion that swallowed her team. She could still see their faces if she let herself. Marcus laughing before deployment. Hale arguing about coffee brands. Rios promising to buy the first round when they got home. She had carried their names like weights, as if surviving meant she owed something unpayable. But standing here now, with the case closed and the network fractured, something inside her shifted again. Maybe survival wasn't a debt. Maybe it was an assignment. Her phone buzzed gently in her pocket. A message from Garrett. Kessler is talking, full cooperation, he wants a reduced sentence. She stared at the screen. Confession in exchange for mercy. Part of her wanted to reject the idea outright. Mercy felt undeserved. Then she remembered something her grandfather once told her after a heated debate at the dinner table. Justice without restraint becomes revenge. She typed back, "That's your call, not mine." A few seconds passed. "You okay with that?" Garrett replied. She looked out over the open desert again. "Am I okay?" The question echoed deeper than intended. For months, maybe years, she had defined herself by reaction. Reacting to loss, to corruption, to threats. Now there was space. And space can be uncomfortable. Yes, she typed finally, "I'm okay." Because mercy wasn't weakness. It was discipline. Later that week, she visited her grandfather's grave again. This time she didn't sit. She stood tall, shoulders back. "They're cooperating," she said quietly. "Deals being made, information exchanged." The breeze moved across the cemetery in soft waves. "I wanted to hate them," she admitted. "It would have been easier." Her throat tightened, but she didn't look away from the headstone. "But you didn't raise me that way." A memory surfaced. She was 10 years old, furious after losing a school competition. She'd thrown her trophy across the yard. Her grandfather hadn't yelled. He'd simply handed it back to her and said, "Control isn't about winning. It's about who you are when you don't." She smiled faintly at the memory. "I think I understand that now." Behind her, footsteps approached lightly on gravel. "Nathaniel." "You talk to him?" he asked gently. "Sometimes." He nodded. "Feels different, doesn't it?" "Yes," she said, quieter. They stood side by side for a moment. "No more warehouses," he said. "No more warehouses. No more late-night alarms." She hesitated. "There will always be something," she said, "just maybe not this." Nathaniel studied her. "You ever think about going back?" "To the teams?" she asked. He nodded. The question lingered longer than she expected. For a long time after Damascus, she had assumed she'd never wear that uniform again. Too much loss. Too much weight. But now, she inhaled slowly. "I think my fight looks different now." Nathaniel smiled faintly. "Teaching." "Guiding," she corrected softly. "Same thing." Maybe it was. The following Saturday, the range was fuller than usual. Word had spread. Not about heroics. About integrity. Veterans brought their daughters. Mothers brought their sons. Teenagers showed up curious and unsure. Ava stood at the front of the line this time. Confident. Focused. Kat walked the row, adjusting stances, offering quiet corrections. No raised voice. No dramatic speeches. Just steady presence. At one point, she noticed a younger girl hanging back, hesitant to step forward. Ignored by the louder students. Kat recognized that feeling immediately. She walked over and crouched beside her. "First time?" she asked gently. The girl nodded. "Nervous?" Another nod. "Good," Kat said softly. "That means you understand this matters." The girl looked up, surprised. "Fear isn't the enemy," Kat continued. "Losing control is." She guided her hands carefully. Helped her settle into position. Between heartbeats. The shot rang out. Not perfect, but solid. The girl's face lit up in disbelief. "I did it." "Yes," Kat said, warmth spreading through her chest. "You did." As the sun climbed higher over the desert, Kat stepped back and watched them all. Different ages. Different stories. Learning discipline instead of dominance. Responsibility instead of rage. She thought about Vance. About Kessler. About the long chain of decisions that had led to quiet corruption. And she realized something simple. Evil rarely begins loud. It begins with small compromises. Small justifications. Small moments where people choose convenience over conscience. Her grandfather had refused that first compromise. She had refused the second. And maybe that was enough. As the class ended and laughter replaced gunfire, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself in a long time. Pride. Not in the arrests. Not in the headlines. But in restraint. In choosing not to become hardened. In surviving without surrendering her humanity. That evening, alone again beneath a sky streaked with fading light, she locked the doors of Morrison's armory and paused before stepping away. The sign creaked softly above her. Morrison's armory. It wasn't a monument to weapons. It was a reminder of responsibility. She took one last slow breath of desert air. For years, she had measured herself by missions completed and enemies neutralized. Now she measured herself differently. By the steadiness of her hands. By the clarity of her choices. by the young voices learning not just how to shoot, but when not to. Because strength isn't loud. It doesn't beg for recognition. It doesn't crumble when tested. It stands, quiet, unmoved by fear, unshaken by anger. And when the world tries to break it, it bends just enough to endure. She turned off the lights and stepped into the night. The fight had gone quiet. But she hadn't. She had simply changed its shape. Sometimes justice is a courtroom verdict. Sometimes it's a sealed warehouse. And sometimes it's a woman choosing discipline over revenge and teaching the next generation to do the same. Because in the end, dignity doesn't shout. It doesn't kneel. It simply stands steady between heartbeats.